Hello, and thank you for joining me for another installment of There You Go with Bryan, the Rock, a.k.a. Alcatraz, located in San Francisco Bay, just 1.25 miles off the coast of San Francisco. The small island started as a lighthouse, then a military fortification, a military prison, and eventually Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The latter operated from August 11th, 1934 until March 21st, 1963. The strong currents around the island and cold water temperatures made escape all but impossible. Since the late 20th century, it has become a major tourist attraction, but once upon a time, it contained some of the most notorious and violent criminals in American history. Public enemy number one, Alan Creepy Karpis, known for his creepy stare, Machine Gun Kelly, Whitey Bulger, and of course, Al Capone. There were lesser-known criminals on the Rock as well, and that's where our story begins. Frank Lee Morris, born September 1st, 1926 in Washington, D.C., abandoned by his mother and father at the tender age of 11, Frank was destined to become a lifetime criminal, bouncing in and out of foster homes and orphanages until he fell in with the wrong crowd. From his first conviction of shoplifting and then graduating to narcotics possession and armed robbery, he was arrested for grand larceny and car theft in Miami Beach. He served time in Florida and Georgia, then escaped from Louisiana State Penitentiary while serving 10 years for bank robbery. He was recaptured a year later while committing a burglary and sent to Alcatraz on January 20th, 1960. It should be noted that while Frank Morris had some hard luck in his life, he did have one thing in his favor: his mind. He was ranked in the top 2% of the most intelligent people in America, with an IQ well over 133. Next up, we have Allen West, born March 25, 1929 in New York City. West was arrested over 20 times throughout his life. He was imprisoned for car theft in 1955. After an escape attempt from the Florida State Penitentiary, he was transferred to Alcatraz in 1957 at the age of 28. And last but not least, we have the Anglin brothers, John, born May 2nd, 1930, and Clarence, born May 11th, 1931. They were born into a family of 13 children in Donaldsonville, Georgia. Their parents, George and Rachel Anglin, were seasonal farm workers. They moved the family to Ruskin, Florida, 20 miles south of Tampa, where the truck farms and tomato fields provided a more reliable source of income. Each June, they migrated north as far as Michigan to pick cherries. Clarence and John were reportedly inseparable as youngsters. They became skilled swimmers as well, and amazed their siblings by swimming in the frigid waters of Lake Michigan as ice still floated on its surface. The Anglin brothers started robbing gas stations and liquor stores while they were still in their teens, but always made a point of committing their crimes after the stores were closed, as they said they didn't want to run the risk of anyone getting hurt. They said that they only used a weapon while robbing one time, and that was a bank in Columbia, Alabama. It should be noted that the gun they used was a cap gun. Eventually, both brothers were captured and sent to Alcatraz prison after they had repeatedly escaped from other prisons. As fate would have it, all four of these men ended up having cells next to each other, and that's where the plot for the greatest prison break in American history begins. Behind all the cells was a dead space with access to plumbing and heating ducts. It was dirty and dusty, and if you were a troublesome or unliked inmate such as Allen West, you were assigned the task of cleaning this area. It was while working this punishment detail that Allen West discovered a small bundle of hand tools, possibly left behind by a long-forgotten work crew. He quickly discovered that with these hand tools, he could slowly chip away at the soft walls of his cell. Remember, Alcatraz is an island surrounded by salty air and humidity, and by 1960, the prison was starting to show signs of decay. It wasn't long before Allen West realized that if he was going to make an escape, he was going to need some help. He brought in his friend Frank Morris, because not only was Frank smart, but while Allen would chip away at the prison wall around his air vent, Frank would play his accordion to mask the sound of the hammer and the chisel. Frank also had the idea to create papier-mâché heads to leave in the beds after they escaped, to give them a little bit more time to get away. The Anglin brothers were brought into the plan because they had access to the prison workshop and could get their hands on raincoats. 50 raincoats to be exact. With the help of some rubber cement and some advice from a popular mechanics magazine that said you could vulcanize rubber with the steam from radiator pipes, the four men were able to fashion the raincoats into a large life raft that would hopefully carry them over the frigid waters of the San Francisco Bay and on to freedom. The four men plotted their escape for 6 months. Every night, they would take turns chipping away the concrete around their jail cell air vent, and then at the end of the night would cover the vent with cardboard to look like the concrete they had removed. After 12 months of painstaking drudgery, they were done. The time had arrived to put their plan to the test. The date was set. On the night of June 11, 1962, with all preparations in place, the men initiated their plan. They all removed their air vent and the cardboard that surrounded the area they had chipped away, and they crawled through the opening into the service corridor. They all made it out of their cells except for West. Apparently, the opening he had carved out was too big, and a few days before he had reinforced it with some liquid concrete from the workshop. By the time it had hardened, the opening was too small for him to fit through. Needless to say, Alan West was forced to stay behind. Meanwhile, in the dark service corridor, Morris and the Anglin brothers climbed the ventilation shaft to the roof. Guards heard a loud crash as they broke out of the shaft, but nothing further was heard, and the source of the noise was never investigated. Hauling their gear with them, they descended 50 feet to the ground by sliding down a kitchen vent pipe, then climbed two 12-foot barbed wire fences. At the northeast shoreline near the power plant, a blind spot in the prison network of searchlights and gun towers, they inflated their raft with a concertina stolen from another inmate and modified to serve as a bellows. At some time after 10 p.m., investigators estimated they boarded the raft, launched it, and departed towards the objective, Angel Island, the halfway point between Alcatraz and the San Francisco shoreline just 2 miles to the north. The water temperature that night was just about 50 degrees. Experts estimate that a human could only survive approximately 2 hours in such cold water before hypothermia would set in. Meanwhile, back in the prison, everything was quiet until 7:30 a.m. when a guard was puzzled as to why Frank Morris wasn't getting up when called to breakfast. When the guard reached his hand through the bars of the cell to shake Frank awake, the papier-mâché head fell to the floor and the alarm was sounded. The search around the coastline started and lasted for days. No sign of the escaped convicts was ever found, except for some random pieces of rubber raft left on Angel Island, along with some scattered footprints and some family photos that belonged to the Anglin brothers. There was also a paddle and a rubber life vest fashioned from raincoats. No official sign of any survivors. After 6 weeks, the case was closed. The 4 escaped convicts were estimated to all be dead, as official sources surmised that nobody could possibly survive the temperature of the water, and the fact that they would have to swim against the tide, well, it was nearly impossible. So what happened to the 3 men? Robert Chechi, a San Francisco police officer, said that at 1 a.m. on the morning of June the 12th, he saw an illegal boat in the bay near Alcatraz. A few minutes later, the boat left, heading under the Golden Gate Bridge. This led to speculation that the prisoners might have enlisted outside Confederates to pick them up. The FBI dismissed Chechi's account out of hand. 7 days after the escape, the San Francisco FBI received a postcard that read, "Ha ha, we made it." Signed John, Clarence, and Frank. But anyone can send a postcard. In 1993, a former Alcatraz inmate named Thomas Kent told authorities that he had helped plan the escape. He said that Clarence Anglin's girlfriend had agreed to meet the men on shore and drive them to Mexico. He declined to participate in the actual escape, he said, because he didn't know how to swim. In 2011, it was reported that, contrary to the official FBI report, an actual raft was discovered on Angel Island on June 12, 1962, the day after the escape, with footprints leading away from the raft. Furthermore, a 1955 blue Chevrolet was reported stolen in Marin County the same day. The following day, a motorist in Stockton, California, some 80 miles east of San Francisco, reported to the California Highway Patrol that he had been forced off the road by three men in a blue Chevy. The same year, an 89-year-old man named Bud Morris, who claimed he was the cousin of Frank Morris, said he met his cousin face-to-face in a San Diego park shortly after the escape. His daughter, who was 9 years old at the time, said she was present at the meeting with Dad's friend Frank, but had no idea who he was at the time. Frank Brizzi, a childhood friend of the Anglins, said he had met the boys in Brazil in 1970, and he even produced a photograph. He also presented an alternative escape theory. Rather than use the raft across the bay, he said that the boys had paddled around the island to the boat dock where they attached an electrical cord to the rudder of a prison ferry that departed the island shortly after midnight, and they were towed behind that ferry to the mainland. Prison records do show that there was an electrical cord that went missing that night. Art Roderick, a retired deputy U.S. Marshal who had once headed the investigation, called Brizzi's photograph of the two men absolutely the best actionable lead we had. An expert working for the U.S. Marshal Service did not believe the photograph was legitimate. However, in January 2020, AI specialists at a facial recognition security firm in Ireland used facial recognition technology to conclude that the men in the photo were indeed John and Clarence Anglin. An Anglin brother, Robert Anglin, reportedly told family members before his death in 2010 that he had been in contact with John and Clarence from 1963 until approximately 1987. He said his brothers were in Brazil. Surviving family members announced plans to travel to Brazil to conduct a personal search, but were cautioned that they could be arrested by Brazilian authorities because the Alcatraz escape remains an open Interpol case. And the clues keep dropping. In 2018, the FBI confirmed the existence of a letter allegedly written by John Anglin and received by the San Francisco Police Department in 2013. The writer asserted that Frank Morris died in 2008 and was buried in Alexandria under a different name, and Clarence Anglin died in 2011. His purpose in writing the letter, he said, was to negotiate his surrender in exchange for medical treatment of his cancer. The letter's authenticity was deemed inconclusive. So, did they make it? Did they beat the odds, do the impossible, and end up sitting under a palm tree sipping a cool tropical drink? Or did they get swept out to sea by the unforgiving ice-cold waters that surround the most legendary and inescapable prison ever built? Who can say? But for just around $200, 4 times a year, there is a company in San Francisco that holds a swim competition. You start on Alcatraz Island and you end up on the shore of San Francisco. They've been doing this competition for right about 20 years, and while no one has ever died, nearly 90% of the participants make it to shore just fine. Thank you so much for joining me for There You Go with Bryan. If you'd like to support this program, please click the Patreon or Venmo link below. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you next time on There You Go with Bryan.